Breaking news, people stop what you're doing. Because hip-hop just got hit with a plot twist so wild it feels like Netflix should have dropped it as a limited series. Picture this, Houston's so-called untouchable godfather, Jay Prince, thought he could pull his classic check-in or else routine on none other than 50 Cent. Yeah, the same 50 Cent who survived 9 bullets, bankrupted Murder Inc., and trolled half the industry into therapy. You think he's about to bow down? Please. But wait, here's where it gets spicy. Out of the shadows comes Tony Yayo Junet's loudest soldier, the guy who says the stuff 50 just smirks at. And rumor has it, Yayo didn't just clap back, he confronted Jay Prince, head-on, like a gladiator walking into the lion's den. Now, let me ask you, if the so-called mob ties boss meets the unfiltered mouthpiece of G-Unit, what do you think happens? Do fists fly? Do cameras roll? Or does somebody's street empire finally crumble under the weight of ego? Yes, trust me, what we uncovered is bigger than rap, bigger than Houston, and might just expose the entire check-in system for what it really is. Buckle up, because this story, it's about to get messy. The story begins with a storm already brewing in the world of hip-hop, because what went down between Tony Yayo, 50 Cent, and Jay Prince is not just another petty rap beef, but the kind of power struggle that defines who really controls the streets and who controls the narrative of the industry. And in this case, it was Tony Yayo standing tall, like the ultimate soldier defending the G-Unit empire after Jay Prince. The self-styled boss of Houston allegedly tried to put pressure on 50 Cent to bow down to the infamous check-in culture. A culture that artists have whispered about for decades, where stepping foot in certain cities without paying homage or seeking approval from local power players can put your safety, your reputation, and your money on the line. But if there is one man in the music business who refuses to kneel to anyone, it is 50 Cent. The man who built his brand on fearlessness, on surviving 9 bullets, on mocking his rivals until they had no careers left, and on showing the world that he answers to no one. So when Jay Prince tried to apply the kind of authority that has worked on others for years, 50 responded the only way 50 knows how, by ignoring the game entirely and laughing at the pressure, and Tony Yayo, the loyal soldier, made it his personal mission to confront the situation head-on. People who have followed Jay Prince know that his story is not just about running Rap-A-Lot records. It is about decades of whispered tales about mob ties, extortion, and influence stretching far beyond music. Because for years, artists have been told that entering Houston without the blessing of Prince is like signing your own death warrant. Stories circulate of rappers losing their chains, entourages being pressed, cars mysteriously disappearing. And somehow those stories always lead back to the same circle of influence. But Yayo was not buying any of it and publicly called out what many have been too afraid to say: that this system is less about protection and more about control, about forcing artists into a game they never asked to play. And this is where it gets really messy, because Jay Prince has been accused before of using theatrics to maintain his aura of control. Remember when NBA YoungBoy's house got robbed in Houston and suddenly Jay Prince appeared online holding his stolen items, presenting himself as the savior who recovered them, only for a young boy to call him out, saying he did not need a middleman parading around on social media for clout, exposing the fact that the so-called protector was more concerned about image than genuine help, and that moment cracked the illusion for many fans. But not enough to shake his power, at least not until 50 and Yayo came into the picture. What makes this clash more explosive is that 50 did not just step into Houston. He invested in it. He opened businesses, made plans to build a film studio, and even received the key to the city directly from the mayor, while Jay Prince had long maintained his shadowy reputation as the real shot caller of Houston. Suddenly, the same city was publicly crowning 50 as one of its own. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. A man known for not checking in was being celebrated on a parade, float in front of thousands, and that was a public slap in the face to the entire idea of bowing to gatekeepers. Yayo, always the blunt voice of G-Unit, took this opportunity to shred apart the system. In interviews and conversations, he made it clear that they did not need anyone's blessing. That check-ins were nothing but extortion dressed up as culture. And he used Pop Smoke as an example, saying that trusting so-called local protection is often the same as signing your own setup, because the same people who claim to protect you are the ones who know your every move. Your hotel, your car, your schedule, and can turn that information against you. And in Yayo's words, that was exactly why G-Unit relied only on their own security. No favors, no outside strings, no hidden debts. By doing this, Yayo wasn't just talking to J Prince, he was talking to the entire industry, exposing a practice that everyone knows exists but few have the courage to challenge. And the timing could not have been worse for Prince, because with the feds looking at hip-hop under a microscope, with whispers of RICO charges and organized crime investigations circling the culture, the last thing someone with decades of rumors about mob ties needs is for one of the loudest voices in rap to publicly call out their tactics. The shadows where power once thrived were suddenly being lit up by G-Unit's defiance. And while Prince continued to insist that his role was one of respect, love, and guidance, the public could not ignore the bodies that kept dropping in the same environments his name hovered around. From the mysterious tragedies surrounding dice games to high-profile robberies and sudden violence, every time his circle was close enough to raise questions. And now those questions were being screamed into microphones by Tony Yayo for the first time in years. The aura of untouchability surrounding J Prince looked vulnerable. Because this was not some young artist trying to break in and prove himself. This was a powerhouse unit led by 50 Cent and amplified by Yayo's unfiltered mouthpiece. And instead of bowing to old rules, they were rewriting them in real time. A direct threat not just to Prince's influence, but to the entire system of street enforced control that has operated unchecked for decades. And that is exactly why this confrontation has become the most talked about scandal in hip-hop circles. Right now, because if the old king loses his crown in public, then what does that mean for the rest of the empire built on fear? The tension only escalated once the whispers of that confrontation started leaking out, because fans were not just watching another back and forth in the rap game, they were watching a potential collision between two different definitions of power, one rooted in the shadows of street politics and the other built on corporate dominance and relentless confidence. And what made it even juicier for the public was how unbothered 50 seemed while Yayo carried the torch of calling things exactly as they were, because it painted this picture of a team where one man leads the empire and the other fearlessly fights the battles in the trenches. And the irony here is that for years people said Yayo was the hot-headed one, the unpredictable wild card of G-Unit, but in this scenario, his words hit harder than calculated moves, because he was articulating what many had been thinking but never dared to say out loud. Behind the scenes, there were rumors of heated phone calls, of messages sent through middlemen, of attempts to smooth things over before they spiraled into something larger. But Yayo was not in the mood to sugarcoat anything, and every time he opened his mouth, the story picked up more fire and more momentum online as blogs and commentators began dissecting each sentence as if it were a coded declaration of war. Anonymous sources began dropping claims that J Prince had already reached out to powerful allies in the South to try and contain the optics that his aura was slipping. And some even alleged that industry executives were quietly discussing whether supporting 50 publicly in Houston might put their business ties at risk, because if the old guard felt disrespected, retaliation could come in subtle but very costly ways. But what made this different from other disputes is that 50 built an empire where controversy is currency and where threats only add more value to his name. Because the more people talk about him, the stronger his brand grows, and that makes him nearly impossible to intimidate. And Yayo amplifying the situation meant that. Instead of silencing the conversation, it spread like wildfire. Online reactions poured in, with fans mocking the very concept of check-ins, posting memes about how 50 was in Houston cutting ribbons on businesses while others were stuck patrolling. Street corners and the narrative began shifting rapidly from fear of disrespecting Prince to admiration of how G-Unit was tearing down the illusion of forced loyalty. Some self-proclaimed insiders even claimed that Prince was furious over how the mayor and city officials openly celebrated 50 giving him awards and keys to the city, while he himself had been the so-called guardian of Houston hip-hop for decades. Without such mainstream recognition, and that jealousy was boiling beneath the surface, fueling his attempts to reassert dominance through pressure tactics. Yayo's statements about Pop Smoke added gasoline to the fire because fans could not stop replaying the tragic irony that so many artists had fallen victim to being set up by the same systems that were supposed to protect them, and hearing a veteran like Yayo expose that in blunt terms resonated with younger generations who are tired of seeing their favorite rappers die young under suspicious circumstances. By painting the check-in culture as nothing more than dressed-up extortion, Yayo created a narrative that even mainstream media picked up, with journalists hinting that the entire system should be investigated under organized crime statutes, and suddenly, what used to be dismissed as street rumor was starting to sound like something prosecutors might actually want to examine. The scandal grew bigger when fake but highly convincing reports surfaced online claiming that law enforcement agencies had been compiling files on these so-called protection networks for years, with Houston as a major focal point, and that the confrontation between G-Unit and Prince could be the spark that forced everything into the open. And whether or not those reports were real, they were believable enough to feed the fire and make the story viral. People started digging up old interviews where artists subtly hinted about being forced to check in or risk their safety, piecing together clips like detectives unraveling a mystery and using Yayo's blunt callouts as the missing puzzle piece that made the entire picture clear. Public opinion shifted heavily, with fans openly clowning the old idea of check-ins while praising G-Unit for standing firm. And that reaction did more damage to Prince's aura than any actual physical confrontation ever could, because once the crowd stops believing in the myth of untouchability, the power structure begins to collapse from within. Meanwhile, 50 did what he does best: staying calm, dropping sarcastic comments, posting photos from meetings with billionaires and movie moguls, essentially showing that while others were stuck playing gatekeeper games, he was operating on an entirely different level, and that contrast humiliated the idea that anyone could pressure him into compliance. What also hurt Prince's narrative is that several young rappers started quietly echoing Yayo's points on social media, liking posts that mocked check-ins or sharing subtle messages about independence, and that digital support signaled a cultural shift that might be unstoppable now that the genie is out of the bottle. Some even speculated that other regions with their own versions of gatekeeping might crumble next, because if Hughes' most feared name can be openly challenged, then who else really holds power anymore? The fallout was not just about image, but about business too, because promoters began whispering that artists were less willing to play along with demands for permission. Once they saw G-Unit walk freely without consequence, and that threatened an entire revenue stream tied to intimidation and leverage. All the while, Yayo doubled down, continuing to use every platform to push the narrative that their crew did not need anyone's blessing to move freely anywhere, and that message carried a sense of liberation for artists everywhere watching from the sidelines, hoping someone would finally say what needed to be said. And in that moment, Yayo became more than just the loyal soldier. He became the loudspeaker of rebellion in a system that had thrived too long on silence. The longer this story dragged out, the more it began to feel less like a petty rap beef and more like a cultural reckoning, because what started as a simple question of whether or not 50 Cent would bend to pressure turned into an avalanche of revelations about the inner workings of hip-hop power structures and the people who had quietly pulled strings behind the scenes for years. And the fact that Tony Yayo refused to bite his tongue became the breaking point that made everybody start questioning who really holds the keys to these cities and who has simply been pretending. When whispers of law enforcement interest started making the rounds, the tension doubled, because if there is one thing everyone in this industry fears, it is outside investigators digging too deeply into long-standing arrangements that were never meant to see daylight. And although nothing official was announced, the chatter alone was enough to set off panic among those who built reputations on intimidation. Because suddenly the curtain was being pulled back and the audience was no longer buying the magic trick. Fans on social media kept replaying the clips of Yayo speaking boldly about K-pop smoke and about fake gatekeepers, and the more people listened, the more it sounded like testimony rather than just off-the-cuff commentary. And that made it all the more dangerous, because now journalists were quoting him in articles as though he had cracked open an unspoken code of silence and turned it into a mainstream discussion. The older generation of artists who had once benefited from check-in systems looked uncomfortable whenever asked about it on podcasts, some dodging the questions with vague answers, others trying to downplay the idea altogether. But the damage had already been done, because Yayo's bluntness made it impossible to dismiss as just rumor, and fans were demanding clarity and transparency. Meanwhile, memes exploded at a rate that even surprised seasoned culture watchers, with images of 50 photoshopped walking through Houston, surrounded by confused bodyguards holding clipboards marked "check-in denied" and captions like 50 don't need permission slips circulating everywhere, to the point where the mockery itself was eroding the image of fear that J. Prince once held. And behind that mockery lay a real shift in how artists approached their careers. Because now younger rappers were openly debating whether check-in culture was actually a scam that drained money and instilled unnecessary fear rather than offering any genuine protection. And those conversations were shaping the future of the business in ways no one had anticipated. Anonymous insiders claimed that several promoters and city-based crews were scrambling to reinvent themselves to distance from the term check-in, and trying to brand their services as artist relations or event consulting. But the internet had already connected the dots, and the audience was not letting them rebrand without ridicule, because the scandal had given them too much ammunition to laugh at the old system. The more J. Prince tried to appear above the fray, the more people speculated that he was in fact furious behind closed doors, especially when stories surfaced about him confronting people within his circle about leaking information and blaming bloggers for blowing things out of proportion. But the truth is that perception is power, and once perception shifts against you, the empire begins to shake. On the other side, 50 Cent is doing what he always does, turning the controversy into fuel for his empire by hinting at a new accusaries, exploring the dark side of hip-hop, gatekeepers dropping cryptic teasers on social media and letting fans speculate wildly while he sat back enjoying the free marketing storm that only made him look stronger and more untouchable. The irony of it all was that Yayo, who had often been overshadowed by 50, suddenly found himself as the unexpected hero of the narrative, the voice that had ignited a movement. And for once, people were giving him credit not just as the loyal sidekick, but as a truth teller who risked the wrath of powerful figures to say what everyone else was afraid to say. Public backlash intensified, with fans demanding that cities stop allowing shadow networks to exploit artists under the guise of culture, and instead focus on building real infrastructure for safety and opportunity. And that demand gained momentum once mainstream outlets started running op-eds questioning how many artists had been harmed or even killed because of these predatory systems. Some commentators even connected the scandal to wider conversations about systemic exploitation, comparing check-in culture to corporate gatekeeping, and arguing that both thrive on silencing dissenters until someone brave enough breaks the code of silence and sparks change. And that is exactly what Yayo had done, sparking change, whether intentional or not, because his words carried weight that rippled far beyond a single interview and forced everyone from artists to executives to fans to rethink how much of the industry's power was real and how much was illusion. As weeks passed without any visible retaliation from Jay Prince or his affiliates, the myth of inevitable consequences began to crumble, further emboldening fans and artists alike to mock the idea that anyone could control who comes in and out of a city. And with every meme, every viral clip, and every sarcastic post, the scales tipped further in G-Unit's favor. The scandal became so large that politicians were even asked about it in passing interviews, with some brushing it off as a music issue, while others hinted that if extortion or organized crime allegations were even partially true, then there might be grounds for real investigations, and that possibility alone had people glued to the story, waiting for the next twist. By now, the confrontation was no longer just about 50 or Yayo or Jay Prince. It had become a symbol of resistance against outdated systems of control, and fans treated it like a victory for freedom of movement, for independence, and for calling out hypocrisy in a space that too often punishes honesty. And the most fascinating part was how seamlessly the narrative tied into the legend of 50 Cent himself, a man who built his career on surviving attempts to control him, to silence him, to stop him, only to come out stronger every single time. And once again, his refusal to bow, combined with Yo-Yo's sharp tongue, had turned potential danger into yet another chapter of dominance. Even those who tried to defend Jay Prince could not match the tidal wave of mockery and skepticism flooding the internet, because the public had already made up its mind. And once the public decides, the court of opinion becomes the ultimate judge and jury. The story ended up being less about who confronted who physically and more about who won the battle of narratives. And in this case, there was no denying that G-Unit had reshaped the conversation by flipping fear into laughter and turning intimidation into irrelevance, and that shift was something no amount of behind-the-scenes power could undo. For once, the mythology of invincibility collapsed, not because of violence, but because of words. Amplified by the digital age and the reminder that in today's world, image is everything, and once it cracks, it rarely ever gets repaired. So now that you've seen how deep this rabbit hole really goes, the question is, where do you stand? Because are you still buying into the myth that certain people control the industry with an iron fist? Or do you see how quickly the empire crumbles when the spotlight exposes what's really happening? And are you ready to admit that one bold voice like Tony Yayo can shift the entire culture with just a few sentences? Because that's the part that nobody saw coming. Think about it for a second. If Yayo had stayed quiet, we might still be pretending that check-in culture is untouchable. But now the conversation has gone global, and people are questioning everything. So what do you think? Is this the beginning of the end for fake gatekeepers? Or will the old guard find a way to claw back their influence? I want to hear your take, because this story is bigger than rap. It's about power, control, fear, and freedom. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's debate it out. Smash that like button if you want more raw, unfiltered breakdowns. And of course, hit subscribe, because this is only the tip of the iceberg and the next bombshell could drop any moment.